It was a crisp, quiet morning in Jackson, Mississippi. The sun had barely risen, casting a gentle light through the small, weathered window of Rosa's shop. It wasn't the kind of place that people passed by and paused to admire. The building was old, the wood warped from years of wear, and the faded sign above the door could barely be read anymore. Rosa's sewing, it said, in chipped white letters. Most people would glance at the shop and keep walking. Only those who knew her or had heard of her from the whispers in town ever ventured inside. Inside the shop, Rosa moved with the grace of someone who had long since mastered her craft. The rhythm of the sewing machine hummed like a quiet heartbeat as she bent over her work. Her fingers, though calloused, moved with the gentleness of someone who cared deeply about what she created. Today, she was stitching the final touches of the wedding gown she had been working on for months. She had never seen the bride in person, only spoken to her over the phone. But for Rosa, the gown wasn't just a job. It was her small contribution to something much bigger, a piece of herself woven into the fabric of someone else's dreams. But that wasn't what made this morning different. It wasn't the gown or the job. It was the women outside her shop, the ones who had been gossiping all morning. Rosa didn't need to listen closely to know what they were saying. She had heard it all before. Mocking comments, thinly veiled ridicule of her accent, her broken English, and the way she spoke as if she didn't belong in their world. She had long learned to block out their words. But today, something was different. "Can you believe she's still doing this?" a voice said, dripping with disdain. Another voice joined in, chuckling. "Still sewing up their clothes. Can't even speak proper English." The laughter followed, light and teasing, as if Rosa weren't in the very room, only a few feet away, working to finish a dress that would soon be worn at a wedding they were all buzzing about. They never saw her as more than the seamstress, the woman from somewhere else, the one with the funny way of speaking, the one they didn't quite understand, but tolerated because she was useful. Stung, but Rosa didn't react. Instead, she kept her head down, her focus unwavering. Her fingers worked with the precision of years of practice. But beneath the calm, something was shifting inside her. Rosa had never cared for their opinions. She had her shop, her work, and a small but loyal customer base. But it was the upcoming wedding that had caught her attention. The bride, a young woman from one of the wealthier families in Jackson, had asked Rosa to help with the gown. The bride hadn't known much about Rosa's life. She hadn't known that Rosa had been saving for years, putting aside every spare dollar, every small bit of profit to fund this wedding. Rosa didn't need to explain herself. The idea that she could be underestimated didn't bother her. It was the reality of having to watch others judge her when they didn't know the half of it. They mocked her for speaking funny. But what they didn't understand was that language wasn't the measure of her worth. It was how she had built herself up, how she had managed to make a living, how she had quietly made her own path in a world that overlooked her. The women outside continued their chatter. They didn't even notice when Rosa got up from her seat and walked to the back of the shop. She picked up a package wrapped in soft tissue paper and tied with a satin ribbon, the gown that had taken her hours of work. It was the culmination of her quiet labor, and in a few days it would be worn by someone else. She held the dress carefully, as if it were a precious thing, because to her, it was. Her thoughts shifted back to the women outside. One of them, a bridesmaid in the wedding, had approached the shop earlier in the week, asking if Rosa could adjust a few dresses. Rosa had agreed, of course, but she had noticed the condescending look the bridesmaid had given her, as if she didn't belong in the same room, let alone in the same conversation. Rosa didn't belong, not in their world. But that had never been her goal. She smiled to herself, a small, knowing smile that only she could understand. It wasn't the mockery that bothered her. It was the simple fact that they never saw her for what she truly was. A woman who had quietly created a life from the seams of her dreams. Rosa placed the gown gently in the back of her car, then drove toward the venue. She had never been inside the ballroom, but she had heard about it. The gleaming chandeliers, the high-ceilinged space that could hold 100 guests, and the extravagance that came with such an event. The town's elite would be there, talking, laughing, showing off the finest dresses and suits. Rosa had never been invited to these kinds of events. And honestly, she hadn't expected to be. But today was different. Today, she was no longer just the seamstress. As she parked outside the venue, her eyes wandered to the grand entrance. She felt the tension in her chest tighten for a moment. But then she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't there to be seen. She wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. But she was about to show them all, in the quietest way possible, just how far she had come. With the gown carefully folded in her arms, Rosa walked to the back door, where the bride was waiting. She knocked softly and was let in by the event coordinator. The room was buzzing with last-minute preparations, but Rosa barely noticed the flurry of activity around her. She was focused on one thing only: the dress. The bride stood before her, eyes wide with excitement. "It's beautiful," the bride whispered. "I can't wait to see it on me." Rosa smiled. "It's yours now," she said, handing over the dress. The bride took it eagerly, but before she disappeared into the dressing room, she paused, turning to look at Rosa. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Rosa shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. This is your day." But inside, Rosa felt something shift. Something quiet and powerful. She had given this bride a beautiful gown. She had helped make this wedding happen, in ways no one could imagine. And soon, the whole town would know just who had made it all possible. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acknowledgement. She had everything she needed right here. Rosa never got used to the way people looked at her when she spoke. It wasn't that she had a heavy accent. It was a combination of the broken English and the way she carried her words, as if they were never quite in sync with the rhythm of the world around her. She had grown up in the Dominican Republic, where the words flowed more naturally, where people understood each other with fewer gaps. But this was Jackson, Mississippi, where everyone spoke the same but said so much more without ever uttering a word. "Can you believe she's still doing this?" Sarah's voice cut through the quiet of the shop as Rosa bent over a bolt of silk, cutting it with the careful precision she'd perfected over the years. Sarah was one of those women who always seemed to know exactly what to say to make everyone feel a little smaller. She was the kind of person who spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never had to struggle a day in her life. And she knew it. Her eyes lingered on Rosa for just a moment too long before she whispered to her friend, "Still here, still cleaning up their messes, and can't even talk properly." The laughter that followed was light, but it stung like a bee's sting on a hot summer day, sharp and sudden. Rosa didn't flinch. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions behind a veil. It was safer that way. The laughter, the mocking glances, the whispers. All of it had been a part of her life ever since she had arrived in Jackson, all those years ago. It wasn't just Sarah. Rosa was a fixture in the town, but only in the background, like the brick wall of a building that held up the roof but never got noticed. The women who came into her shop, the ones who acted like they didn't see her when they asked for alterations or dropped off clothes for repairs, saw her as a helper, nothing more. They rarely took the time to even ask her how her day had been. But when it came time to talk about their own lives, to complain about their husbands, their children, or the latest gossip, Rosa was always there to listen, and they took advantage of it. Today, the women in the shop were talking about the wedding, a big event that had been the talk of the town for weeks. Jackson, Mississippi, wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis, but it had its moments. Weddings were one of them. This wedding, in particular, was happening in the heart of downtown, a venue that had been transformed into a glittering, elegant space for the bride's big day. The bride herself came from one of the wealthier families in the area. Her father owned the biggest furniture store in town, and her mother had organized every social event for the last 10 years. To the women in Rosa's shop, this was the epitome of the good life. They talked about it as if it were the event of the year, the one where everyone would be expected to put on their best smiles and wear their finest attire. But they never mentioned Rosa's name when they spoke about the wedding. Not once. No, the only time they ever spoke about her was when they were mocking her. "You'd think she'd be saving for something better than this?" said Clara, another one of Rosa's customers, as she flipped through a fashion magazine, her eyes never really leaving the page. Rosa remained silent, cutting the fabric with precision. She didn't need to respond. She had been here before, listening to these women talk about how they thought they had everything figured out. They didn't know how hard she had worked. They didn't know how she had saved every penny, how she had lived frugally, and how she had put herself through years of struggle to get to this point. It was never about them, anyway. It was about her. It had been like this ever since she moved to the States. She had come here from the Dominican Republic in search of a better life, a dream that many people had, only to realize that the American dream wasn't as easy to reach as they had said. Jackson was a small city, but it had its cliques, its social circles, and Rosa was never allowed to be part of any of them. She wasn't rich enough. She wasn't American enough. Her accent, the slight pause in her sentences, were constant reminders that she was different. Even after all these years, it still stung. But Rosa had come to accept that. She had come to realize that people didn't need to understand her, and they didn't need to accept her. All that mattered was that she understood herself. While the women continued their gossip, Rosa thought back to when she first arrived in Jackson, how the town had seemed so big and intimidating, how she had felt so small in the midst of it all. The first job she found had been as a cleaner in a local hotel, scrubbing floors and changing sheets. She had no choice but to take the job, even though it wasn't what she had hoped for. But little by little, she had saved, scraped, and fought for a chance to do something more. She started picking up sewing jobs, fixing clothes for people, and then one day she had enough money to open the shop. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Yet, no matter how much she achieved, there was always someone around to remind her of where she came from, always someone to make her feel like she would never truly belong. That night, after closing the shop, Rosa made her way to the venue. It was located in a more upscale part of downtown Jackson, a neighborhood she'd driven through but never really been a part of. As she approached the venue, the bright lights from inside poured through the windows, casting shadows on the empty street. The venue was beautiful, with its large columns and marble floors. She had seen it on the outside before, but tonight, she was walking through its grand doors, holding the gown she had worked on for months. The event coordinator met her at the back entrance, ushering her into the hallway that led to the bride's dressing room. The woman looked at her with a slight nod of acknowledgement, but Rosa could see the judgment in her eyes. The coordinator was polite, but Rosa could tell she wasn't thrilled to have a seamstress at the venue. She had probably expected someone more fancy to deliver the gown. But Rosa didn't mind. This wasn't about them. This was about the bride. As Rosa handed the gown to the bride, she saw the awe in the woman's eyes. It wasn't about the gown. It was about what it represented, the culmination of months of work, of sacrifice, of saving every penny she had. And no one would ever know the full story behind it. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the sleepy town of Jackson, Mississippi, the weight of Rosa's actions started to settle in. She had delivered the wedding gown, but something inside her had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The quiet confidence, the strength she had always carried, had somehow grown louder. Rosa had been waiting for this moment for years, but she had never realized how much power she held until now. Back at her shop, the sewing machine hummed softly, cutting through the silence of the room. She was stitching a few last-minute alterations for a regular customer who needed a quick fix for a charity event. The fabric in her hands was vibrant, contrasting the deep, muted blues of the night before. The rhythmic sound of the machine, the smell of freshly cut fabric, and the soft brush of the air from the open window were the only things she could focus on. Rosa wasn't thinking of the mocking laughter from the night before. She wasn't thinking of the quiet judgment that lingered in the back of her mind. No, today her thoughts were filled with something different. She could still hear the bride's voice echo in her mind. "I don't know how to thank you," she had said, her eyes full of gratitude. Rosa had smiled, but deep down, she knew that the bride could never understand the magnitude of what she had done. The work wasn't just about the gown. It wasn't even just about the wedding. Rosa had worked years for this moment. The hours she spent mending clothes, saving every penny, and building the reputation that had led her here. As the morning passed, Rosa found herself looking at the wedding invitation again. She had received it the week before as a formality, and had put it in the drawer of her desk, never intending to attend. She had no reason to. There would be no invitation for her to walk down the aisle, no seat at the table with the others. But the wedding was still hers in a way. She had contributed to it in ways no one knew. She had made it possible. The streets of Jackson were quiet this time of morning. People bustled through their day, heading off to work or running errands. But Rosa wasn't like them. She didn't live by the clock. Her hours were her own. She had spent years learning to work within her own rhythm, finding peace in the steady hum of her sewing machine, in the simplicity of each stitch she made. There were moments when she found herself standing still, simply listening to the silence around her. It was in those moments, when the noise of the world faded away, that Rosa truly felt at peace. But that peace was often fragile. As she worked on the alterations, the hum of the machine almost became a lullaby. Her thoughts wandered back to the events of the night before, to the way the bridesmaids had stood there, whispering about her accent, her broken English, as if it were something that defined her. The insults had never been loud or overt, but they were always present. The kind of quiet judgment that made you wonder whether you were truly accepted or simply tolerated. Rosa had lived with that for as long as she could remember. She had learned to carry the weight of it, to keep her head down and her work steady. But last night was different. When she walked into that ballroom, holding the wedding gown in her hands, everything had changed. It wasn't the gown itself. It wasn't even the fact that she had been the one to fund the wedding. It was the quiet understanding that had settled in her heart. For the first time, Rosa felt seen. She felt like the woman she had always been, but never allowed herself to acknowledge. She had stepped out from the shadows of her own life and into the light. The quiet strength that had always been a part of her, that had been built from years of hard work and sacrifice, was now something more. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. And Rosa wasn't just surviving. She was living. As she folded the last piece of fabric, a smile spread across her face. It wasn't a boastful smile. It wasn't the kind of smile someone wears when they've won a battle or proved something to others. No, this was a smile of quiet realization. Rosa had always known that she was capable of more than people thought, but she had never fully understood the extent of it. Now, standing in her shop with the last of her work done for the day, she felt a deep sense of peace. She was proud of herself, not because she had proven something to anyone, but because she had finally understood her own worth. That afternoon, after locking up the shop and heading home to her small apartment just outside of Jackson, Rosa took a moment to sit on the worn leather sofa that had been with her since she moved into the place years ago. The apartment was small, modest even, but it was hers. It had taken a long time to make it feel like home. She had painted the walls herself, hung up old photographs from her hometown in the Dominican Republic, and placed plants along the windowsills. Small touches of color and life in the otherwise gray space. She had everything she needed. She didn't need the validation of the women who laughed at her behind her back. Nor did she need the approval of those who thought she wasn't capable of anything more than stitching clothes. Rosa had created her own success, and that success wasn't measured by anyone else's standards. It was measured by her own. And yet, there was something else. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She knew that the town was watching her now. They were all waiting for her to slip, for her to fail, to reveal that she wasn't the person they thought she was. But Rosa didn't care. She had done what they thought was impossible. She had shown them that there was power in quiet strength, in the ability to stay true to yourself when the world was telling you to be something else. As the evening settled in, Rosa walked out onto her balcony, the warm Mississippi air wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She looked out over the neighborhood, watching the streetlights flicker to life one by one. She could hear the distant sounds of children playing, of families sitting down to dinner, of the town carrying on with its rhythms. She was a part of that rhythm now, even if they didn't always see it. Her journey wasn't over. There would be more obstacles, more moments where she would be underestimated, more people who would make assumptions about her based on her accent, her background, her humble beginnings. But now, she understood something that had eluded her for so long. The strength to overcome those moments didn't come from others, came from within. Rosa leaned against the railing, closing her eyes, and let the cool night breeze wash over her. For the first time in a long time. And that was enough. The day of the wedding arrived quietly, as mornings in Jackson, Mississippi, often did. Rosa stood by her shop window, watching the early light break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the street. The usual hustle of the town hadn't started yet, and the air was still cool with the remnants of the night. Today, however, felt different. Rosa had spent the last few days working on small orders for customers, alterations for a few dresses, a quick repair on a suit for a man who needed it for a job interview. The rhythmic hum of her sewing machine had become a comforting background to the otherwise silent mornings. But today, the shop felt oddly still. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was full of anticipation. She couldn't deny it. The wedding that had been the talk of Jackson for months was now only hours away, and it was a milestone in her own life, whether anyone else knew it or not. She wasn't attending the wedding. She wouldn't be sitting at the fancy tables or dancing under the extravagant lights. But her mark was all over it, woven into the very fabric of the event. Rosa had never imagined herself in such a position. She'd always thought that success came with grand gestures, with flashy displays of wealth and recognition. But now she understood something different. She didn't need to walk down the aisle to feel proud. She didn't need to be celebrated publicly to know that her contribution was invaluable. The thought stayed with her as she gathered the last few pieces of fabric that had been sitting on her workbench. She folded them neatly and tucked them away into a drawer before locking the shop and heading home to prepare. The wedding venue was located in a well-to-do part of Jackson, a neighborhood where the homes were large and the lawns were always impeccably manicured. Rosa had never been to that part of town. In fact, it felt almost foreign to her, as if it were a place that belonged to someone else, someone who didn't understand the struggles of making ends meet every month. She drove past it often, taking the long way around just to see the grand houses, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the large gates that seemed to keep out more than just the weather. But today was different. Today, Rosa was walking into one of those grand spaces. She wasn't just walking in as a passerby or an outsider. She was walking in as someone who had made the impossible possible. She was going to be part of that world, just for a moment. The thought made her heart race, but she shook it off, focusing on the task at hand. She arrived at the venue an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The elegant building stood tall and grand, its white marble columns gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, it was even more magnificent, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceilings and polished floors that gleamed as if they had just been cleaned. Rosa was led to the back of the building where the bridal suite was. She followed the event coordinator through a series of hallways, trying to ignore the sounds of laughter and chatter coming from the main hall. The bride was getting ready, and everything had to be perfect. Rosa stopped in the hallway outside the bride's dressing room, waiting for her to finish getting into her gown. The coordinator gave her a nod, signaling that it was time. She knocked softly on the door, and the bride's voice called out from inside, "Come in!" As Rosa entered, she was struck by the sight before her. The bride, a tall, slender woman with delicate features, stood in front of a full-length mirror. The gown, which Rosa had worked on tirelessly for weeks, was now on the bride's body, its intricate lace details and delicate embroidery glistening in the soft light of the room. The bride turned, her eyes wide with awe as she caught sight of herself. "It's perfect," she whispered. Rosa couldn't help but smile. The gown fit the bride perfectly, and every seam, every stitch was just as it should be. The hours of work, the late nights spent making sure everything was flawless. It had all paid off. But there was more to the moment than just the gown. "Thank you," the bride said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." Rosa nodded, her hands folded in front of her. "You're welcome. It's all yours." There was a brief silence, and then the bride looked at her with a soft smile. "You don't get enough credit for what you do, do you?" Rosa didn't know how to answer. She had always been the one behind the scenes, never seeking attention or accolades. But there was something in the bride's eyes, something that made Rosa feel like she wasn't invisible anymore. "No one ever really sees the work, do they?" Rosa said, her voice soft but steady. She wasn't angry. There was no bitterness in her words. It was just the truth. The bride smiled again, and in that moment, Rosa saw something shift. It wasn't just about the dress. It was about the acknowledgement of her worth. The respect that had been denied to her for so long was now being given freely, even if it was just for a moment. After the bride had finished getting ready, Rosa stepped back into the hallway, her work done. The ceremony would begin soon, and she wasn't invited to stay. But she didn't mind. She had already made her mark. She had already given the bride the most important part of the day. As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She wasn't just the seamstress from the small shop down the street. She had contributed to something beautiful, something that would be remembered. And that was enough for her. But even as she walked away, her heart heavy with a sense of quiet triumph, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had spent years living in the shadows. But now, it was time for Rosa to step into the light. The days following the wedding were quieter than Rosa had expected. She returned to her shop, where the familiar hum of the sewing machine resumed its steady rhythm. The gossipy women had yet to stop by, perhaps because they were still caught up in the excitement of the wedding, but Rosa didn't mind. She hadn't expected anything to change overnight. She had made her mark, and now, the quiet hum of her work was enough for her. But there were moments, especially in the evenings, when loneliness crept in. Rosa had always kept to herself, but now, there was a certain emptiness that settled in her chest. It was as if something had shifted in her, and though she had earned the respect she deserved, there was a deeper longing that lingered. She wanted more than just respect. She wanted to be seen as something more than the seamstress, more than the woman who had been overlooked for years. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as Rosa was finishing a pair of alterations for a local family, the door to her shop opened with a soft chime. She didn't look up immediately. Her focus was on the fabric in front of her, the edges of the dress she was working on needing her full attention. But when she heard the familiar voices outside, her heart skipped a beat. The group of women had returned. Rosa's hands paused. She knew they were talking about the wedding again, no doubt dissecting every moment, every piece of the evening, and gossiping about all the latest details. The familiar sting of being an outsider returned. She had built her life around this shop, this corner of Jackson, but every time they walked through her door, it was a reminder that she was still, in their eyes, the outsider. "Do you think she had anything to do with the gown?" one of the women asked in a voice that dripped with mockery. "I don't know," said another. "She's always been so quiet. Who knew she could pull off something like that?" The tone was light, but Rosa could hear the underlying judgment. It was subtle, but it was there. They still couldn't see her for who she truly was. And they were still questioning how someone like her could be part of something as grand as the wedding. "I still can't believe it. The dress, though, it looked way better than anything I would have expected from her," Sarah said, her voice tinged with skepticism. Rosa's grip on the fabric tightened, her fingers curling around the edges as she steadied herself. They hadn't changed. They still saw her as less, still reduced her to a mere seamstress. The door chime jingled again, and when Rosa finally lifted her gaze, she saw the familiar faces of Sarah, Clara, and the others standing in the doorway. They all smiled at her, but it was a smile that didn't reach their eyes. Rosa could tell they had come to talk, to gossip, to test her, to see if they could pull something more out of her. She wasn't fooled. "Rosa," Sarah began, her voice soft but full of that thinly veiled condescension that had been so familiar to Rosa over the years. "You did such a beautiful job on the gown." "Really?" Rosa nodded, her expression neutral. "Thank you." Sarah took a step closer, her eyes scanning the workbench, the fabric strewn across the counter. "You must be proud. A wedding like that, It must have been a big deal for you." The words were sweet, but Rosa could hear the underlying mockery. They didn't believe in her, not fully. And they certainly didn't believe that she had played a bigger role in the wedding than they could fathom. "I've done my share of weddings," Rosa replied calmly, her voice steady but firm. "It's not a big deal." But Sarah wasn't satisfied. She wasn't ready to let go of her preconceived notions. "I just don't get it," she said, glancing over her shoulder to the other women. "How does someone like you, someone with such a thick accent, end up funding something like that? It's almost unbelievable." The question hung in the air like a weight, and Rosa felt her pulse quicken. The mocking tone in Sarah's voice, the disbelief in her words, it stung more than she cared to admit. How dare they question her? How dare they reduce her efforts, her sacrifices, to nothing but a fluke? She put the fabric down and turned to face Sarah and the others. Her voice was calm but tinged with the quiet strength she had been building over the years. "I worked hard for this. I've been saving for years. I didn't come here to play a part in your drama or to meet your expectations. I came here to build a life for myself." The silence that followed was thick. The women shifted uncomfortably, their smiles faltering as Rosa's words lingered in the space between them. She wasn't backing down. She had given too much of herself to let anyone continue to underestimate her. "You think I don't know what you say behind my back?" Rosa continued, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I hear you, and I know what you think, but you have no idea how hard I've worked. You have no idea how much it cost me, in every sense, to get to where I am." Clara, who had been silent until now, looked at her with something resembling surprise. "You funded the wedding?" she asked, almost incredulously. Rosa nodded slowly. "Yes, I funded the wedding. I worked every day, saved every penny, and I made sure that this bride had the day she deserved. She didn't just get a gown. She got my time, my energy, and my sacrifice. But that's something you'll never understand." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the women seemed unsure. They were speechless, caught off guard by Rosa's strength. They had expected her to shrink away, to falter under the weight of their judgment. But Rosa had given them no such satisfaction. Sarah, still taken aback, cleared her throat. "We didn't mean—" "Don't," Rosa interrupted softly but firmly. "I don't need your pity. I've been here long enough to know what kind of people you are. I've worked too long to let you try and diminish my worth." There was a long silence, thick with the weight of Rosa's words. The women stood there, not sure how to react, unsure of how to respond to someone who had finally stood up for herself. "I think you should leave now," Rosa said quietly, her voice no longer angry, but calm, resigned, and final. One by one, the women left the shop. Sarah hesitated, a final attempt at some apology forming on her lips, but she quickly shut her mouth when she saw the firmness in Rosa's eyes. The door swung shut behind them with a soft chime, and for the first time, Rosa was alone in her shop with only the hum of her sewing machine for company. She sat down, her hands resting on the workbench, and closed her eyes. She had said what needed to be said. She had finally made them understand that she was no longer going to be overlooked, no longer going to be the butt of their jokes. She wasn't just the seamstress. She wasn't just a quiet, invisible woman working behind the scenes. She was something more, and it was time for them to see that. Rosa wasn't going to wait for permission anymore. She wasn't going to seek approval. She had already proven who she was. The week following the confrontation with the women in her shop was quieter than usual. Rosa didn't hear the familiar laughter and gossip echoing in the streets outside her shop. For the first time in a long time, it seemed as though the town had shifted its gaze. Somewhere away from her, perhaps, but also in a way toward her. She wasn't sure if they had started to respect her, or if they were simply uncertain of how to deal with the woman who had quietly asserted her worth. Either way, the silence felt different this time. It was not the uncomfortable silence of being ignored. It was the calm of knowing that the storm had passed, and something new was beginning. Rosa wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't seeking their approval. But for the first time in years, She could feel her own sense of peace settling deeper within her. It was as if a weight had been lifted. She could breathe easier now, and she no longer had to carry the invisible burden of trying to fit into a world that had never quite accepted her. But even as the silence filled the shop, there was something else. Something that Rosa had learned over the years but had only recently come to fully understand. Change was never loud. It wasn't like a sudden burst of energy or a grand gesture. Change was quiet. It settled in, like the calm before the storm, and only those who were willing to listen closely could hear it coming. The phone rang, pulling Rosa from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID. It was the bride, the one who had worn the gown she had spent so many hours perfecting. For a moment, Rosa's heart skipped a beat. What if something had gone wrong? What if the gown had torn? What if the bride was calling to complain? Rosa quickly picked up the phone. "Hello, Rosa." The bride's voice came through the line, warm and full of emotion. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did. The wedding was perfect. The gown was... It was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined." Rosa smiled, her heart warming at the sound of the bride's gratitude. It was the kind of thank you that no one could have faked. It was genuine, pure, and filled with the kind of emotion that made all of Rosa's hard work worth it. "I'm glad everything went well," Rosa said softly. "You looked beautiful." The bride paused, and then her voice became more serious. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, her tone shifting from one of gratitude to something more contemplative. "The guests were shocked when they found out you were the one who funded the wedding. They didn't know. I didn't tell anyone. But I wanted to make sure you knew that it didn't go unnoticed." Rosa's heart skipped again, but this time, it wasn't with fear. It was with something more akin to hope. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice almost trembling. "There were a lot of people who didn't understand how someone like you could do something like that. But by the end of the night, after everything came together, they were all talking about you. About how you made it happen. How you made the wedding come to life. They saw you. They finally saw you for who you are." Rosa could hardly believe it. The same women who had mocked her, the same people who had written her off as an outsider, were now talking about her in a way that made her feel, what? Seen? Respected? Perhaps. "I didn't do it for them," Rosa said quietly. "I did it for you. For your day." "I know," the bride replied, her voice filled with warmth. "But now everyone knows. They understand. And it's because of you. You've made a difference, Rosa, in ways you'll never fully understand." The conversation lingered for a moment, but Rosa didn't need to hear anything else. She had been seen finally. And though it was not the grand recognition she had once imagined, it was something more meaningful, something deeper. It wasn't about the acknowledgement of others. It was about the respect she had earned in the quietest of ways, in the corners of her own life, and through the very work she had always done. The phone call ended, and Rosa was left standing in the middle of her shop, a soft smile crossing her face. She had never needed grand gestures or public acknowledgement. She had needed this, to be seen not for the work she did, but for who she was. But as the day wore on, she began to understand something even more profound. She wasn't just the seamstress anymore. She wasn't just a woman who worked quietly in the background. She was someone who had made a mark, not with noise or with anger, but with determination, skill, and heart. Her life wasn't just about the wedding she had funded. It was about every small victory, every piece of fabric she had sewn, every thread she had pulled together to create something greater than herself. As dusk began to settle over Jackson, Rosa stepped outside of her shop. The air was cool now, the light soft and golden as it fell over the streets. There was a gentle breeze that whispered through the trees, the kind of evening that seemed to hold the promise of something new. She took a deep breath, the scent of the earth and the air mingling with the faint fragrance of jasmine from a nearby flower shop. Her eyes scanned the street, taking in the familiar sights. The small houses lined up on either side of the road, the old bakery where she had bought her bread for years, the park where children still ran and played. Jackson, Mississippi had always been home to her, but today it felt different. Today, She could feel a shift in the air, a quiet understanding that had taken root not just in her heart, but in the very fabric of the community around her. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to her family back home in the Dominican Republic. She hadn't seen them in years, but every decision she made, every step she took, was shaped by them. They had taught her the value of hard work, of patience, and of quiet strength. They had taught her that no matter where she came from, no matter how much others might doubt her, her worth was always hers to define. And now she has defined it, not by standing in the spotlight or seeking recognition, but by doing what she had always done, working quietly, making a difference, and proving through her actions that she was more than what others saw. As she made her way back to her apartment, the sounds of the town echoing in the distance, Rosa knew that this was just the beginning. She had never sought fame or fortune, but now, for the first time, she realized that her life had already been a success. She had built something real, something lasting, and it was hers to keep. The road ahead would still be challenging. There would always be those who doubted her, always. And in that quiet certainty, Rosa found her strength. She had come far, and she had done it on her own terms. The world had tried to define her, but she had redefined herself. The days that followed the wedding were filled with a strange sense of calm. Rosa wasn't sure if it was relief or something more profound, but the weight of her actions had settled inside her like a quiet storm. She had always known that her life's work meant something, but until that phone call from the bride, she had never realized how deeply her quiet contributions could resonate with others. The shop remained steady as always, customers coming in, chatting with her, offering small words of gratitude here and there, but there was a new awareness in the air. People no longer looked at her with the same disregard they once had. There was a subtle shift in their tone when they spoke to her. They didn't just see Rosa as the seamstress anymore. They saw her as something more, even if they didn't fully understand it. The recognition wasn't loud. It wasn't a parade or an extravagant acknowledgement, but Rosa felt it in the way the world around her seemed to breathe more easily. The mocking laughter from the women in town had faded, and while Rosa didn't expect them to change overnight, she knew something had shifted in the air. And it wasn't just them. It was her. She had finally allowed herself to see her own worth. One afternoon, as she was finishing an order for a local businessman, the door chime rang. Rosa glanced up from her sewing machine, and her heart skipped when she saw who had walked in. Sarah, the last person she had expected to show up in her shop, especially after their last conversation. Sarah was standing by the door, her arms folded across her chest, looking slightly unsure of herself. Her usual air of superiority was gone. Rosa could see the hesitation in her eyes. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The quiet stretched out between them, and the tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat, her voice sounding less condescending than usual. "Rosa," she began, shifting on her feet. I wanted to apologize for how I acted the other day." Rosa didn't immediately respond. She didn't need to. She had already made her peace with the situation. But Sarah continued, her voice softer this time, almost as if she were searching for the right words. "I didn't understand," Sarah admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. I thought you were just a seamstress, just someone who did a job and that was it. I didn't realize everything you've been through, everything you've done. I was wrong about you." Rosa didn't know how to react. She hadn't expected Sarah to apologize, much less in such a sincere way. She had expected more mocking, more laughter, perhaps even more judgment. But here was Sarah, admitting that she had been wrong. It was the last thing Rosa had expected, and yet, it felt like the right thing. She paused for a moment before responding, her voice steady and calm. "It's all right. You didn't know. I'm used to it." But Sarah shook her head, stepping closer to the counter where Rosa stood. "No, it's not all right. I should have known better. I've seen how you work, how much effort you put into everything you do. I just didn't understand. And I was too proud to admit that." Rosa finally met her gaze, her eyes softening. She had worked hard for the peace she felt now. She had spent too many years trying to make herself fit into a world that never quite accepted her. But now she knew that her place was one she had built herself. And if Sarah could see that, maybe there was hope for the rest of them. "I've never asked for anyone's approval," Rosa said quietly. "I've never needed it. I've always done what I thought was right." Sarah nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. "I get that now. I think I always thought people like you were beneath me. But I was wrong." The apology, though unexpected, was genuine. And in a strange way, it felt like a turning point, not just for Sarah, but for Rosa as well. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself, trying to show people that she was more than just the seamstress, that she was more than the sum of her flaws and limitations. Now, she realized that the people who truly mattered, the ones who were willing to see her for who she was, had already begun to change. She didn't need to fight for recognition. It was already on its way. "It's all right, Sarah," Rosa said, her tone calm but firm. "I don't need your apology, but I do need you to understand something. It's not just about me. It's about what we all contribute in our own ways. It's about the quiet work that goes unseen. It's about showing up, day after day, even when no one notices." Sarah nodded again, her eyes shining with something that resembled respect. "I think I finally got it." As Sarah left the shop, her shoulders slightly less tense, Rosa felt a small, quiet satisfaction settle over her. It wasn't a grand victory. It wasn't a public moment of triumph. But it was enough. She had seen the shift in Sarah, and that was enough for her. Rosa went back to her sewing machine, the steady rhythm of the machine filling the quiet space of the shop. The hum of it was like a reminder that no matter how much the world changed, there were some things that remained constant. Her work, her dedication, the quiet strength that she had built through years of hard labor and sacrifice. Over the next few weeks, Rosa noticed more changes. The women who had once mocked her didn't come into her shop as often. When they did, there was a subtle shift in their tone. They still didn't see her as equal, not yet, but they had stopped pretending that she was invisible. And for Rosa, that was enough. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need them to like her. She just needed them to see her. And they were starting to. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about the years of hard work that had gone unnoticed, the struggles that no one had ever acknowledged. Rosa was beginning to understand that she didn't need to change for anyone. She didn't need to fit into their world. Her world was her own to build, and she was doing it one stitch at a time. But there was something else. As much as she had grown in the eyes of the town, she had grown more in her own eyes. She had realized that she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The value of her work, of her life, wasn't something anyone could take away. It was hers. She had built it quietly and steadily, without needing anyone's approval. And that, Rosa realized, was more powerful than any recognition. It had been a month since the wedding, and Jackson seemed to be shifting in ways that Rosa had never imagined. The streets weren't any less busy, the small-town rhythm still the same, but in the quiet corners of her shop, Rosa could feel it. A change in the air, a subtle shift in the way people spoke to her, the way they looked at her. They weren't looking through her anymore, as they once had. They weren't dismissing her as the seamstress with the broken English or the quiet, foreign woman who didn't belong. Now they saw her. Maybe not fully, but it was a start. Rosa spent her days at the workbench, stitching new clothes, altering old ones, working as she always had. But in the quiet moments between the fabric and thread, she began to notice the small things, the glances from passers-by, the nods of recognition from familiar faces, the conversations that seemed to acknowledge her presence without judgment. For the first time, she felt like she was truly part of the fabric of the town. Not just a thread in the background, but a piece that belonged, woven into the greater pattern. And yet, it wasn't the recognition from the town that made Rosa feel different. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was the realization that she had always been enough. She didn't need the world to see her worth. She had seen it for herself, and that was what mattered. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a world that didn't understand her. And now, she understood something far more important. The only approval she needed was her own. Rosa's thoughts were interrupted one afternoon when the door chime rang again. She looked up, her fingers still wrapped around the fabric she was cutting. But this time, it wasn't one of her regular customers. It was someone new. A young woman entered the shop, her eyes wide with curiosity as she glanced around. She seemed nervous, unsure of what to say, but there was a certain determination in her step that reminded Rosa of herself. The woman's dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she wore a pair of well-worn jeans and a simple shirt. It was clear that she wasn't here for a quick alteration or a dress repair. "Hello," the woman said softly, her voice almost tentative. Rosa gave her a smile, the same calm smile she always offered her customers. "How can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman continued, stepping further into the shop. "I heard about you from a friend. You're the one who did the wedding gown, right?" Rosa nodded, setting down her work. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but there was something about the woman's tone that told her this wasn't a regular inquiry. There was something more, something deeper, hidden beneath the surface. "Yes, that was me," Rosa said, her voice steady. The woman hesitated before speaking again, her eyes searching for the right words. I've been thinking a lot about you, about what you did. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to ask you something." Rosa gestured toward the chair in the corner of the shop. "Please sit down. What's on your mind?" The woman took a deep breath before sitting down. She clasped her hands together, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you this. My name is Lena," she said, offering a small but nervous smile. I'm a seamstress too, but I'm just starting out. I don't have a shop or anything like that. I work out of my apartment doing alterations for people in town." Rosa raised an eyebrow slightly. The younger woman seemed hesitant, but Rosa could sense that this wasn't just a casual conversation. There was something more she wanted to say. Lena continued, "I've been watching you. I've seen your work, and I've heard about how you helped with the wedding. It's not just the dress. It's everything. The fact that you funded it all. I didn't know women like you existed. Women who do what they do without asking for anything in return. I don't know how to explain it, but I've been so inspired by you." Rosa sat back in her chair, taking in what Lena had said. Her words were raw, honest, and something Rosa had never expected to hear. She was touched, but more than that, she was humbled. She had always felt like an outsider in this town, never truly understanding her place in it. But here was a woman, a stranger, who saw her, saw what she had done, and felt moved by it. Lena looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation. "I don't know if I can do what you did. I'm just starting out, and sometimes it feels like nobody sees me. Nobody sees what I'm trying to do. I've been working so hard, but I don't know if I'll ever get to where you are. I don't know if I can ever have a place like this." Rosa's heart softened as she listened to Lena. She could see herself in this young woman. The same doubts, the same fears, the same longing for recognition that Rosa had once felt. "You're already where you need to be," Rosa said gently, her voice filled with quiet wisdom. "You don't need anyone else to tell you that you're enough. You're already enough, Lena. You're doing something that matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We all start somewhere, and it's the hard work, the dedication, the quiet moments that no one sees. That's what builds your future." Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry in front of this woman, this stranger who had become an unexpected mentor. But something about Rosa's words resonated deeply within her. "I'm sorry," Lena said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to dump all of this on you. I don't know who else to talk to." Rosa smiled, her face soft with understanding. "You don't have to apologize. I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to wonder if anyone will ever notice you. But I promise you, if you keep going, if you stay true to yourself and keep working, people will notice. It's not about them. It's about you. And when you believe in yourself, everything else falls into place." Lena nodded, taking a deep breath. For the first time, there was a small spark of hope in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of hope that comes from grand promises or instant success. It was the quiet, steady hope that comes from knowing you're not alone in your struggle, that someone else has walked the same path, and that you, too, will get through it. "Thank you," Lena said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I needed to hear that." Rosa stood and walked over to the counter, picking up a few rolls of fabric. She handed them to Lena with a gentle smile. "Take these. They're on the house. Consider it a little push forward, a reminder that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll get where you need to be." Lena took the fabric, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you. I won't forget this." As Lena left the shop, Rosa stood there for a moment, watching the door close behind her. The shop was quiet again, but the silence now felt different. It was a silence filled with possibility, with the weight of something unspoken between them. Rosa had given Lena more than fabric. She had given her something deeper: confidence, hope, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most important things are the ones we don't see immediately. Rosa turned back to her sewing machine, but this time, her heart was lighter. The work ahead of her wasn't just about the clothes or the stitches. It was about the people she had helped, the lives she had touched. And for the first time in a long while, Rosa didn't feel invisible. She felt like a part of something much bigger. The following weeks were a blur of work and quiet reflection. Rosa's small shop, tucked away from the hustle of Jackson's bustling streets, had become something of a sanctuary for those who sought her services. The whispers about the wedding, about the woman who had funded it, had quieted down, but Rosa had felt a change in the town, nonetheless. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but there was a shift. A shift in the way people regarded her, in the way they spoke to her, in the way they interacted with her. The small victories had begun to stack up, and for the first time, Rosa allowed herself to truly savor them. She was no longer the woman with the broken English, no longer the invisible seamstress in the corner of town. She was Rosa. She had become more than the sum of her struggles. But even as the days passed, there was a nagging thought that lingered in the back of her mind. Rosa had never been one for attention. She didn't crave the spotlight. She didn't need to be recognized or lauded. But what if this was it? What if her life, her journey, had always been destined to stay small and unnoticed, despite the small triumphs she had earned? What if the town would move on, forget about her, and slip back into its comfortable routine, leaving her as just another face in the crowd? One afternoon, while Rosa was working on an order for a regular customer, the door chime rang again, and this time, it was someone she didn't recognize. The woman who walked in was older than Rosa, perhaps in her mid-60s, her face lined with the wisdom of someone who had seen a great deal of life. Her hair was silver, swept back into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp but kind, scanned the room before settling on Rosa. "Hello," the woman said, her voice soft but confident. "I'm looking for the seamstress." Rosa smiled, putting down the fabric she had been working on. "That's me. How can I help you?" The woman stepped closer, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I've heard a lot about you, Rosa. The wedding, the dress. You've done quite a bit for this town, haven't you?" Rosa felt a small flicker of unease. It wasn't that she didn't want to be recognized. It was just that she had never been one to seek recognition. She had always preferred to remain in the background, doing her work quietly and without fanfare. The woman continued, her gaze steady. "I'm Grace Bennett," she said. "I've lived in Jackson for most of my life, and I've watched this town change over the years. And let me tell you, Rosa, people like you, people who work hard, who give without asking for anything in return, are rare. It's time we started seeing you for who you are." Rosa was taken aback. She didn't know Grace, didn't know how much of her life Grace had witnessed in the small town, but there was something in the woman's words that resonated deeply with her. "I'm just doing what I can," Rosa said quietly. "I never thought I needed to be seen." Grace smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to hold years of understanding. "Sometimes we don't realize that we're already seen, Rosa. People are paying attention. They're watching what you've done, and they're starting to understand. You've earned their respect. Rosa looked down at her hands, which were still calloused from years of sewing, still rough from the work she had done in the quiet solitude of her shop. I never did it for anyone else's approval. I just did it because it was the right thing to do. Grace took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. And that's exactly why you've made a difference. You didn't do it for approval, but you earned it anyway. And now, it's time for the town to recognize what you've done. Rosa felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning whether she would ever be more than the woman behind the sewing machine. She had never sought attention, never wanted the accolades that others had received. She had worked quietly, hoping to make a difference without anyone noticing. But now, here was Grace, a stranger, telling her that what she had done mattered, that the work she had done in silence had already been seen, already valued. "Why are you telling me this?" Rosa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace's smile deepened. "Because I think it's time you realized that your story is important. It's time you saw yourself for what you truly are." Rosa felt a lump form in her throat. She had never thought of herself as someone whose story mattered. She had always believed that her life, her work, had been too small to be worth anything more than a quiet acknowledgement. But Grace's words stirred something in her, a recognition that, perhaps, her story was worth telling. Perhaps her quiet strength was not just something for her to carry alone. "I've been thinking about the future," Grace continued, her tone more contemplative now. "There are people in this town who could learn a lot from you. Your story, your work, it could inspire them. And you have a place in this town, Rosa. Place in history. You've already changed lives, and you'll continue to do so." Rosa shook her head, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just a seamstress," she said, almost as if trying to convince herself. "No," Grace replied firmly. "You're more than that. You've built something, Rosa, and it's time for the world to see it." The words hung in the air, and F.O. to her actions, not to any external recognition. But now, she understood that it wasn't just about the work she did. It was about the legacy she was creating. For the first time, Rosa didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt like the woman who had woven something meaningful out of the threads of her life. She had created something not just for herself, but for everyone around her. And that was worth seeing. Grace continued, her voice steady with conviction. "You've done more than just sew clothes, Rosa. You've sewn yourself into the very fabric of this town, and I think it's time you let others see that." Rosa stood in silence for a moment, taking in Grace's words. She didn't need to say anything in return. She didn't need to convince Grace of anything. Grace saw her, just as she was, and that, Rosa realized, was enough. She had already achieved what she needed to, quietly, steadily, and without anyone's approval. But now it was time to let others see what she had built. The weeks after Grace's visit were filled with an unfamiliar kind of clarity for Rosa. It wasn't that everything had suddenly changed. It was that, for the first time, Rosa saw herself in the light of others' eyes. She had always defined her worth by the work she did, the threads she stitched together in the quiet corners of her shop. But now, she understood that her work was not just functional. It was a reflection of her strength, of her resilience, and of the quiet power she had carried all along. She had built something that mattered, and people were starting to see it. It was early on a Saturday morning when Rosa finally decided it was time to take the next step. She had been mulling over the idea for weeks, since the day Grace had told her to see her own value. She had been thinking about the way the town had shifted its gaze toward her, how people who once dismissed her now acknowledged her presence. The whispers had died down, but the respect had remained. Rosa stood in front of the full-length mirror in her small apartment, adjusting the dress she had chosen to wear. It was simple, a deep blue gown she had made for herself years ago. She had never worn it out of her apartment, always telling herself there was no occasion for something so beautiful. But today she was going to wear it. Today she was going to step outside of the comfort of her shop and into the world. She slipped into her shoes, the heels unfamiliar beneath her feet, and took one last look in the mirror. She looked different, not just physically but emotionally. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more assured. She felt like a different woman, one who had finally allowed herself to believe in her own worth. The decision had been a long time coming. Over the years, Rosa had built a small but successful business. She had created a life from the ground up, working tirelessly to earn every penny, every piece of recognition she had ever received. But now, she was ready to show the world who she truly was, not just as the seamstress who fixed clothes, but as the woman who had quietly shaped a legacy of her own. Rosa left her apartment, stepping into the bustling streets of Jackson, Mississippi. It was a Saturday, and the town was alive with activity. People were heading to the market, children were playing in the park, and cars honked as they navigated the narrow streets. Jackson was still the small town she had always known, but something about it felt different now. More vibrant, more welcoming, more alive. She walked down the familiar streets, taking in the sounds of the town, the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of children. As she made her way toward the center of town, her steps felt purposeful. She wasn't just walking through the town. She was reclaiming it. She was no longer the invisible woman working behind the scenes. She was a part of it just as much as anyone else. Rosa's shop was located on the edge of the downtown area, a modest space tucked between a local bakery and a hardware store. It had always been quiet, always been a place where people came to get their clothes fixed. But today, she wasn't just opening the door to her shop. She was opening the door to something more, something bigger. She unlocked the door, pushing it open with a small creak, and stepped inside. The shop was empty, save for the half-finished garments hanging on the walls and the steady hum of the sewing machine in the corner. It was quiet, as it always was in the early hours of the morning. But today it felt different. Today it felt like the start of something new. Rosa walked over to the counter where she had spent years working, and she took a deep breath. She had spent so many years pouring herself into this shop, making sure every stitch was perfect, every detail attended to. She had done it all quietly, without expecting anything in return. But now, she realized that she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to work in silence, hoping someone would notice her. She could step into the light, and she could share her story. She sat at her sewing machine, her fingers hovering over the fabric. She hadn't planned on working today, but it felt right to start. There was a piece of fabric in front of her, a garment that she had promised to finish for a regular customer. She ran the fabric through her fingers, feeling the texture, the weight, the potential. She had always loved the feeling of fabric beneath her hands, the way it changed and shifted as she worked her magic. But today it wasn't just about work. Today it was about something more. It was about claiming her place in the world. It was about acknowledging her own worth and telling the world that she was no longer just the seamstress. She was Rosa. She was a woman who had created something extraordinary from the simplest of things. Her first customer of the day arrived just as she was finishing the alterations. It was a woman she hadn't seen in years, a local teacher who had been one of the first to give Rosa a chance when she first opened the shop. The teacher had always respected Rosa's work, but Rosa had never expected the kind of respect that was now being offered to her. "You've really made a name for yourself, haven't you?" the woman said as she stepped into the shop, glancing around at the work Rosa had done. "People have been talking about you. They say you're the best in town." Rosa smiled, her eyes soft. "I've just been doing what I know best," she said, her voice steady. "But thank you." The teacher paused, her expression thoughtful. "It's more than just the work, Rosa. It's the way you've built something out of nothing. You've shown us all what hard work, dedication, and quiet strength can accomplish. You've made us all realize that no matter where we come from, we can create something that matters." Rosa felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had worked so long in the shadows, so long hoping for someone to recognize her worth, and here, finally, was someone who understood. The teacher wasn't just complimenting her work. She was acknowledging the journey, the struggle, the quiet triumph that had been woven into every piece of fabric Rosa had ever touched. "Thank you," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." The teacher nodded, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "Keep going, Rosa. Keep doing what you're doing. You've made a difference in this town. Don't ever forget that." As the teacher left, Rosa stood silently in the middle of the shop, the words lingering in her mind. She had made a difference. She had woven herself into the fabric of Jackson, and no one could take that away from her. For the first time in her life, Rosa allowed herself to feel pride. She had built something that mattered. She had worked tirelessly, quietly, and now, she had earned something far greater than just respect. She had earned her place, not just in the town, but in the world. And as she looked around at the familiar walls of her shop, Rosa realized that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to come. The quiet triumph she had achieved wasn't the end. It was just the start of a new chapter. A chapter where she didn't hide in the background, but stepped forward, boldly, as Rosa, the woman who had changed her life and the life of the town around her.